a history of the peace process course, like those myths and facts books that many of us grew up with that was put out every single year. Nor really is it a platform to debate or to advocate policies, specific policies regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Rather, after the first three broader, more introductory sessions, we will have the opportunity to study Jewish values, to examine our own value priorities. In essence, to understand how Jewish values shape our aspirations for Israel, and also at the same time, how Jewish values can influence our own policy perspectives on where we stand in the spectrum of beliefs about the Israeli-Palestinian issues. The goal, ultimately, is to foster a more pluralistic and especially respectful dialogue with people whom we may disagree with when it comes to Israel politics. And finally, hopefully, we will grapple with our own relationship with Israel as Jews living in an era of Jewish sovereignty outside the land of Israel. Now, I would emphasize again, our purpose is not to determine if currently there is a Palestinian peace partner or if a specific policy on settlements is realistic or not. Our goal really is to have an internal Jewish conversation about our own values, our aspirations, our hopes, and our visions. So I want to start out in a very easy way, since almost everybody, I'm sure, coming on has a connection or feels a connection to Israel. So I'd like you to spend just 2 minutes, and then we'll do a few minutes of responses, which you can put in the chat if you'd like to, or I'll take hands, people, as I scroll through the screens or the virtual hand. So I want you to think of any one of 3 questions for an answer. What Israel means to you personally, what Israel means to the Jewish people, and what Israel means to the world. You don't have to answer all 3. What does Israel mean to you? What does Israel mean to the Jewish people? And what does Israel mean to the world? So let me give you a minute or 2 to reflect on that, and then we'll come back. And once again, you can put comments in the chat, or I'll ask for people to speak on screen. If we were in person, it would be a lot easier. We could turn to our neighbors and have a discussion. Okay, so I'll thank Heidi for putting in the chat to her that Israel is a place to call home that cannot be taken away. I'm sure that there's a lot of us that feel that way, given our knowledge of the history of our Jewish community. Would anybody like to share an answer to any of those three questions?
Okay, I started to put it in the chat, but I'll just say it. The fact that Israel, we can take so much pride in Israel, not just because we're a Jewish state, but because Israel has contributed so much in the world of technology and medicine, and this tiny little country has done so much for the whole world, and that to me is amazing.
Okay, thank you. Yes, and Eris or Brian, one of the two of them, a community to keep the Jewish faith and practices moving forward and vibrant. Anybody else? I don't see any hands up, or you can unmute. Oh, Zelda. You have to unmute.
I think that after the Holocaust, the birth of Israel gave Jews new hope because so many lives were lost during the Holocaust, and having a new land gave rebirth and hope and new generations of.
Okay, thank you. So for the Jewish people, not just throughout all of history, but more particularly in generations that some people here tonight remember very well, really a safe haven after the Holocaust of sorts. Anyone else? All right, Rachel put in the realization and actualization of Jewish peoplehood. Okay, so we have that concept that we're familiar with, that we are all a Jewish people, and the concept of Jewish peoplehood, which is an important part of our identities as Jews. Thank you. Anyone else? You can unmute.
Yeah, I think it's like the glue that holds the Jewish people together. It's a base. It's a place that we could keep thinking about, and like unity, because it brings all parts of the Jewish community together.
Okay, and thank you. For some people, that is very important, but literally one of the reasons for having this course is the fact that for a large part, as we know, of American Jewry and diaspora Jewry, they don't necessarily feel that way, and they don't feel that their values and their conversation is being respected in some ways. So it's interesting. Yes, many of us feel that way. And Scott wrote, "The place where Jewish people can achieve their potential." Okay, thank you very much. Anybody else?
Like the Vatican to Catholics.
Okay. Without a land, right? So it's a
Right.
little different.
No, as land.
Okay, anybody else? All right, so I just want to take a few minutes in doing that. We're going to be watching two videos tonight. The first one is an introduction, sort of a foundation for the values discourse. And no, don't show it yet, but that's fine. You can get it ready. And I thank Valerie for running the tech, and also would say that if we have anybody that feels tech savvy that would like to run it next week or the following week, and could download the videos and or text, please email me and let me know, or email Valerie. So what you're going to hear in a moment in this sort of introductory lecture for the series by Daniel Hartman, who is the head of the Hartman Institute. Cindy and I have studied there before for the summer, taking courses online, and I see by the names, many of you, they've been especially successful over the pandemic in bringing tens and tens of thousands of people together for different seminars. So we're going to hear a little bit of the goals of these series of lectures. The aim isn't to shape or to change anybody that's attending tonight's politics on Israel. The aim is really to shape the way we think about politics, and especially the way that we talk about Israel with each other. the fact that we really need to learn to talk about values that we share and not merely the politics that we don't. I'm going to repeat that again. We need to learn how to talk about the values that we share and not merely the politics that we don't. Right? We need to learn that political disagreement need not imply a rejection or a dismissal of someone whose primary values about Israel are different from ours, and hopefully discover that by focusing on the values and ideas which lie at the foundation of our politics, each of us can foster greater understanding, greater respect for each other without whitewashing the differences. Now, as I look at the names of those who are joining here this evening, I know that we've had a little bit of practice over the last 2 years in doing this with our JTS-sponsored series of great debates and beyond dispute. That's exactly what we did. We learned to talk about the underpinning of Jewish values and how in our Jewish tradition and in the text, specifically in the Mishnah and the Talmud, the rabbis sometimes would just debate an issue and they wouldn't necessarily come to a conclusion, but would highlight which of the values were most important. And of course, we spent a lot of time, even in the political discourse running in the election, through the election 4+ years ago, in how to have dialogue around values and what the ideas are of a machloket l'shem shamayim, having a disagreement for the sake of heaven, or the concept of elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim, having understanding about this and this are both values that we hold. We just may prioritize one value over another. So we're going to listen to this first video, which takes about 15 minutes. While we're listening to it, think a little bit about maybe if this brings up important values that drive your political opinions about Israel, but also whether or not there are opinions about Israeli politics that you find difficult to hear. And what you do when someone in a community, when you're having a discussion in your home, espouses political views about Israel with which you strongly disagree. So let's watch the video. Can you make it larger, Valerie? You can't see it. Even when you download it and you know how to do it technologically, it doesn't always work right away. Nope. I know this is obvious, but did you click on it to open it up? I just see a click at the top, but double click. Maybe if you get it open on your screen first as a video and then share. Yay.
Welcome to I Engage 3, entitled Jewish Values and the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict. Being part of a people, seeing oneself as part of a people, is one of the deepest and most essential aspects of Jewishness. Judaism is not merely or even primarily a system of faith and religious and moral practices, but a connection to a people who've been walking together for over 3,000 years, caring for each other, working together. One of the central motivations for the I Engage project as a whole is to help sustain and maintain Jewish peoplehood in the face of new realities which are threatening to undermine it. Since its inception, the State of Israel has served as a unifying force in world Jewry. We couldn't pray together. Our ritual practices and even many of our values divided us from each other. But we had Israel. Supporting Israel was something that transcended our differences. We wouldn't go into each other's synagogues, but we could march together in the Community Israel Day parade. Today, Israel no longer plays that role, nor does it serve as a cohesive force for Jewish peoplehood. Very often, Israel itself has become the source of deep divisiveness, acrimony, and mutual alienation far greater than our denominational divides. Our goal in I Engage is to reverse this phenomena and to provide tools to enable new foundations for a relationship with Israel and for overcoming the deep intolerance around Israel that has infected our community. To do so, we cannot avoid the areas of conflict and disagreement. We can no longer argue that they must be put aside for now, given the extenuating circumstances and the current crisis situation. Since its inception, Israel has had extenuating circumstances and one long extended current crisis. And the divisiveness around Israel which we now encounter, and the increased alienation or distance from it, has arisen despite, if not precisely because of this context. We simply disagree with each other on how best to navigate these extenuating circumstances. Just as Israel needs to learn to survive and thrive within this context, so too does a relationship with Israel need to learn to survive and thrive despite this context. We need to learn to talk with each other and to think about Israel within a crisis reality. To do so, we need to put the issues that most divide us from each other and from Israel at the fore of our consciousness and challenge ourselves to develop new ways of thinking about Israel and talking to each other in precisely these areas of deep dispute. What is dividing world Jewry from Israel? What issues are making a shared conversation about Israel challenging, if not seemingly impossible? In I Engage 2, entitled The Tribes of Israel, A Shared Homeland for a Divided People, we dealt in depth with the difficulty that the idea of a Jewish state poses to those who are committed to the value of democracy, and to world Jewry for whom democracy is a core Jewish value and separation of state and religion self-evident for religious freedom. In I Engage 3, we want to confront the most difficult issue which is dividing us today, and that is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Some wonder how they can understand, relate, and identify with an Israel whose policies are so different from their own. Others wonder how they can talk with and tolerate Jews who advocate for positions which they profoundly disrespect and feel are dangerous to the future of Israel. In I Engage 3, we do not aim to shape or change your politics on Israel. We do aim to change and shape the way we think about politics, and more importantly, the way we talk about Israel with each other. Our assumption, and I believe yours as well, needs to be that good people, decent people, intelligent and informed people can confront a set of facts and a particular reality and reach different, though mutually legitimate conclusions. During these sessions, I want to ask you to set aside your personal political positions and takes on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I want you to open your ears and your hearts to hear and to learn. It might be helpful to remember that when we talk about Israel, we're not deciding at this moment the future of Israel. We are deciding, however, the future of our community. We want to invite you to delve deeply and engage in the ideas and values which are the underpinnings of the conflict, instead of the facts and politics of the conflict. It is our belief that a shared political platform is not attainable. A shared or more commonly held system of values, ideas, and ideals, or at the very least, a shared respect for our differences, is achievable. As a community, we need to remember that the values we live by and aspire towards are the essence of who we are. The history of the Jewish people, the story of the Jewish people, is about a commitment to the place of ideas and values in the real world, more than it is about a commitment to any specific political perspective. A political discourse divorced from this values debate is a discourse divorced from our very nature as a people. It can neither get us where we want to go, nor encourage us to be who we ought to be while trying to get there. A Jewish discussion of policies and politics are about bringing values into the real world, often a dangerous world. But that is only possible if we engage in a process of learning and talking about the values themselves that animate our positions. I engage is about engaging in such a values clarification. We need to learn to talk about the values that we share and not merely the politics that we don't. We need to learn that political disagreement need not imply a rejection or dismissal of the other's values. We need to discover that by focusing on the values and ideas which lie at the foundation of our politics, we can foster greater understanding and greater respect for each other without whitewashing the differences. The significance of a values conversation, however, goes beyond this point. Israel is not merely an increasingly divisive reality. It is for too many Jews an irrelevant reality. For too many, a disagreement about Israel's politics is a motivation for disengagement from Israel itself. By refocusing our conversation around the values which can and ought to lie at the foundation of Israel's policies, we reopen the door for renewed engagement with Israel, even if someone might disagree with some of its current policies and positions. Through a values conversation, we create the possibility of connecting Israel's story with a larger Jewish story, which transcends political and geographic divides. We can, in short, create new connections with Israel and with each other. The reality of increased disengagement with Israel is a good background for raising one of the more divisive issues we face when talking about Israel, in particular when it relates to issues which impact on Israel's security. One of the common refrains hindering an open discussion is the sense that we ought not to tell Israel what to do, since our lives are not on the line. It's easy to tell Israel to withdraw to this or that border, or to refrain from this or that compromise, when the consequence of each decision are borne by Israelis alone. As a result, the argument goes, North American Jews should simply refrain from the conversation and leave this issue to Israelis to discuss and to debate. There is much justice in the above argument. To be righteous or defiant for someone else is easy. And great care and modesty needs to be exercised when giving advice to another under these circumstances. That said, there are 2 points that need to be emphasized and which serve as the foundation for our discussion in this whole series. The first point is the distinction between telling someone what to do and telling someone what you think. The first may be arrogant and should be avoided, or at least curtailed, when the other's life and well-being is on the line. The latter, in which you merely share what you think and in no way try to determine for the other what they should do, leaves the decision in the hands of the one who has to live with the consequences. Sharing one's thoughts in this context is an act of friendship, enrichment, and empowerment. Second, and equally important, goes back to a point I alluded to before. When we don't talk about Israel, we stop thinking about Israel and ultimately stop caring about Israel. In a time and context in which we all are deeply engaged with Israel, there is great merit in asking how we best express that commitment and what limits we should place on the conversation. When we do so, we only shape the conversation. We do not threaten it. In our generation, however, we have to begin to internalize the fact that the core challenge is not the nature of the conversation, but whether to have it at all, whether to engage with Israel at all. In this context, all conversation, even ones which we believe may cross the line between sharing what we think and telling others what to do, are better than the alternative, which is no conversation at all. In today's world, we do not protect Israel when we limit conversation. We actually endanger it in brand new and profound ways. Now, I know that for some of you, this may be a hard idea. But I Engage 3 is about hard issues. An issue which divides us not merely with regards to policy and politics, but also with regards to the nature, culture, and boundaries of our conversation about the topic. Let's again remember a point made above. We can relax at the very least in the context of these sessions. The future of Israeli-Palestinian negotiations is not going to be determined by what we say to each other during these sessions. The future of our relationship with each other and our community's relationship with Israel may very well be decided. Let's make room for each other so that there will be room for Israel in our hearts. Let's turn for a moment and talk more deeply about the nature of a values conversation, which is at the heart of the I Engage learning experience. My colleagues and I will reiterate this throughout the series, and it is one of the key fundamentals which you need to hold onto as you hear different ideas and values put forth throughout the upcoming sessions. When talking about values as distinct from debating politics, it's important to remember that we're not talking about a zero-sum game, where if I accept one value, then by definition I negate all others. A value conversation is more inherently a tolerant and complex one. I can accept a value as important without claiming that it's the only one which is important. I can accept a value as a part of a larger whole without having to argue that it itself constitutes that whole. I can respect a value as valuable, but believe that under certain circumstances, it cannot be implemented or needs to be deferred in the face of conflicting values and circumstances. If you remember this, you will be able to keep an open heart and an open mind to truly hear the other. You will be able to learn more about yourself, as well as what motivates others. You will create a safe space where ideas could be put forth and valued without worry about the so-called ideological price you may have to pay from hearing and respecting the other. My friends, we're not in a good place. If you remember and assimilate these core rules of a values conversation, we may be able to change the destructive discourse around Israel that we have allowed to take hold in our community. We may also be able to create a broader tent of engagement and identification with Israel. Please join me on this journey as we engage with one of the most difficult and complex issues of our time, as we engage with Israel and one of the most critical challenges shaping its future, as we engage with each other around Israel in a new and hopefully constructive way.
Okay. What's amazing, actually, just as a little more of a background, and in a few minutes after we have a short discussion, I'll tell you in general about it, is that this was prepared with all the speakers and interviews that are part of this about 6 or 7 years ago. Although the issues are even more critical now than they were 5 to 7 years ago. One of the things that Daniel Hartman often talks about, no matter what the topic, is that anything worthwhile to our basic identity as Jews, as some of you reflected, always requires the attempt to complexify the issue. I like that term, to complexify the issue, to expand our thinking and our perspectives in an environment in which different issues can be raised without one idea being the only correct one, but a spectrum of ideas that we're open to experiencing. That requires a little bit of humility, right, as he expressed. There is a distinction also, I want to reiterate, between expressing to people what we think in a safe environment than when we seem to be telling people what to do, right? Ultimately, we know that Israel is a healthy democracy, and Israel will ultimately make the decision of the direction that they go in. But it doesn't mean that we don't have an opinion and that we can't have this kind of values conversation that will be inclusive and will get other generations besides all of us that are primarily here and supportive of Israel. I literally just got an email from the college son of a member of the congregation who asked to talk to me a couple weeks ago about feeling in conflict as a college student and with some of those values and with the issues around the Israeli Palestinian. And I was looking to see if he was here tonight. I wouldn't highlight, but he's not, and I'll make sure to tell him that he can hear this at least, and hear as we begin the process of sharing together. So before we started that video, I asked the question about opinions that you may hear about Israeli politics that you find very difficult, troubling to hear, and attendant to that, what do you do when someone you're having a conversation with in your home or in the community has political views about Israel with which you very strongly disagree? Anyone want to share, either in the chat or in person?
Yeah, it's Brian Chorney. I'll share something.
Go ahead.
So when I engage with somebody that I'm not meeting for the first time, so there's some commonality in the relationship, I find it not combative, but I get different responses from somebody who is either holds a dual citizenship, US and Israel, or has made Aliyah or spent many years in Israel, as compared to somebody who's always and only been a US citizen. Completely different takes on what you just asked about. Opinions of what goes on in politics. Completely different takes when you live there versus if you just do a 2-week vacation or something. Okay,
so that's a part, in a sense, of what was, thank you, of what was expressed, that sometimes Israelis want to be able to say, we're the ones that live there and we know and we need to make all the decisions. And I think what Daniel Hartman is arguing is that in the end, yes, the cabinet of Israel is not going to change, nor the decision-making based on our conversations. On the other hand, as part of world Jewry and feeling a part that Israel is a critical element to that, some people express the center of our identity and Jewish peoplehood, we do have a right and something to contribute in what we think. And sometimes there's a big divide. There is no question that more than ever before, there has been a divide over the last number of years between Israelis understanding diaspora Jewry, American Jewry, and what's important to them, and the same in America, and truly understanding the values and the things that are important to Israelis. Anybody else want to share? Okay, Scott, I see.
Yeah, I think.
I can't
Oh, go
see
ahead, Scott.
everybody if you raise, but go ahead.
I think it really depends on who you're engaging with. You need a partner on the other side of the conversation. Your question was how do you reach out to them? How do you respond to them? And if I have someone on the other part of the conversation that has different views, but has them from a meaningful place and wants to engage in meaningful conversation, you can agree to disagree and maybe you both learn something. And I look forward to those conversations. If I'm engaging with somebody who just wants to talk and doesn't have any interest in listening and trying to convince someone, it's very difficult to be the engaging person for both parts of the conversation, and typically shut down, unfortunately.
Right. So thank you. And that happens a lot, I'm sure, to many people, in our reactions to them and in their reactions to us. And I think that's why the goal, Hartman's goal, beyond this first few sessions, is to talk about how you can turn around a conversation about values and the values that you share and where the priority are in those values. Anybody else? No? What would you say?
David, oh,
Go
sorry.
ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just going to say, in the past, when I might have been confronted by somebody saying, oh, Israel should let the Arabs back in and reclaim the homes that they were chased out of, I found that to be an easier conversation to defend Israel. But I must admit, in more recent times, when the conversation centers around the Israeli-Palestinian situation, I find that to be a more challenging conversation to engage in.
Okay, thank you. And tonight in the next video, we're going to hear about the 5 different kinds of solutions, and you're going to think about where you stand there. And there are large sections of the Israeli population and Jews around the world that actually might even disagree about the first part that you find easy in dealing with. And Sue had added, practically, American Jews and others provide a lot of financial support. And that's true, although that is and continues to be true. And that's another reason why sometimes we as a community are careful in what we say about Israel, because we know that Israel does rely on the support, and that's a very other complicated conversation, including what happened just in the last couple of weeks with politics around re-upping the rearmament of the Iron Dome that protects Israel. Okay, so let's go on. Now, I just want to mention that first of all, in the Divrei this week or last week, where you saw the course advertised, there's something that you can click on, as well as on our website, where our courses are listed, that you can register for the course. You can even go on hartman.il and put register. But what's appeared in the Divrei and others are step-by-step instructions, so you can register, which will allow you to watch all the videos that we see, to watch the supplemental interview videos of which we may or may not see or watch parts of. But just as importantly, and I think this is critical for the next video especially, to read the supplemental readings. So there are short readings. Each one may take from 5 to 10 minutes that explicate some of the videos and give you a deeper understanding that certainly we're not going to have the time to address as it is right now. Even tonight's, we're supposed to be 2 separate units of an hour to an hour and a half that have to be truncated. So what I would encourage you is to sign up. And then I just wanted to highlight that we'll see how it flows. But as I mentioned, the first few units, beginning with the next section on the spectrum of views in the Jewish world about Israel, and then the next two on living with difference and the Israel that we imagine. Well, then in the next series, either in the wintertime or early spring, based on our calendar, we'll deal with the different values, many of Judaism's core values that intersect around where we stand. Core values like a narrative of peace, attitude towards the land, of justice, of self-preservation, of compromise. And those will be the content value laden courses that build on having a discussion about Israel. So the next video that we're going to watch is 25 minutes long. It's by Tal Becker. All the videos are about scholars that work in the Hartman Institute. And again, those that have studied or heard them, they're all excellent speakers and very perceptive and very clear in describing the issues. This video essentially explores the attitudes toward the Israeli-Palestinian conflict across the Jewish world by emphasizing those different values as well as the moral claims that lie between each of these five core positions along the spectrum. And what Tal Becker attempts to do is to frame and essentially, as I've reflected before, to establish a basis for this values discourse about the conflict in which different positions are understood in value terms. The result, obviously, hopefully, to teach us to engage seriously to try to mine the values in our own positions as well as the positions of others. So the question I'm going to ask you in advance is in the second third of his presentation. Tal Becker talks about 5 different spectrums of Israel from one end to the other, from 2 states as a moral imperative, 2 states as a policy, 2 states as an aspiration, 1 state as a policy, 1 state as a moral imperative. Think as you're listening to these and sort of, remember it or jot it down, where, as you're listening to this, you yourself would place, where you would place yourself in Tal's 5-part spectrum of different views. And if those are the values that guide your position in that respect. So just think about, where you are. Sometimes you can be in more than one of them. Okay, Valerie?
As we begin our journey in today's opening session, we will start by mapping out the spectrum of ideas and political divides within the Jewish community regarding the pursuit of Israeli-Palestinian peace. Where are the political divides, and what are the core differences between us? The goal is to provide a general articulation and deeper understanding of the nature of the disagreements that are alienating us from Israel and each other. And by charting this map, begin the process of setting forth a space for all of us to sit around the table.
Let's take a step back and try to look as objectively as we can at how the pursuit of Israeli-Palestinian peace, and especially the pursuit of what is called the two-state solution, is talked about today across the Jewish world. Now, we should acknowledge, of course, that peace, as an idea and as a Jewish value, is about much more than reaching some agreement on an Israeli-Palestinian two-state outcome. Peace is, at least in part, about a fundamental shift in consciousness and human action. And in Jewish sources, it is as much, if not more, connected to interpersonal relations than international relations. But our goal here is not to explore all the potential meanings of peace, but to understand how the Jewish discourse on peace plays itself out today. If we want to change and deepen this discourse, we need first to have a much better grasp of where it actually stands. And that means understanding with much more sensitivity the different attitudes that are expressed in relation to the idea that peace can be achieved through a two-state framework. For the sake of this exercise, we need to take politics out of the equation just for a moment and observe how peace is spoken about in practice, as if we were all psychologists listening to the Jewish people lying on the couch in front of us. If we do that, I want to suggest that we can see a spectrum of views that in the end can be encapsulated into 5 core positions on the two-state outcome. Most, if not all of us, fall somewhere along this spectrum. Some of us have moved from one point to another on the spectrum over time, or advance a combination of these points. But I think this spectrum of 5 positions helpfully defines the range of the Jewish conversation on this issue. And it is worth taking some time to map out these 5 positions, telegraphically, without claiming, of course, to present them in any exhaustive detail. As I do this, I want you to think about where you position yourself on the spectrum, but also to begin to appreciate the different values, assumptions, and ideas that animate each position on this spectrum, and may motivate people to take a position different from your own. I want you to try not to be angered by other positions, not to immediately think of the counter-argument, but to take the time to really listen to the position and think what sentiments may lay behind it when that position is genuinely and thoughtfully expressed. Let's begin with the first of those 5, which I would describe as people for whom the idea of 2 states, of achieving a two-state outcome to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, is a moral imperative for the Jewish people. The rhetoric, the language, the arguments that people in this camp use relate to the idea that the Jewish people should not be controlling another people. They speak in terms of Palestinian rights. They speak about the destructive role, in their view, of Israel's occupation. They make the claim that a people who have experienced the kind of persecution that the Jewish people have experienced throughout history should be champions of the rights to self-determination of others, not just their own. For advocates of this position, Palestinian statehood is not something we should avoid if we can and tolerate if we must. It is something for them that we as Jews are morally required to champion, even if we must at the same time seek to guarantee that that Palestinian state is a functioning and responsible neighbor to Israel. And so people who support this position couch an argument about peace in the language of what it is as Jews to be obligated to the rights of others. What is it that we need to do in order to ensure that we are acting morally in relation to the Palestinian people? They speak of a real urgency for big, immediate Israeli decisions to create a two-state outcome out of what they argue is our moral obligation. That's the first view, 2 states as a moral imperative. As we shift across the spectrum, there's a second view that you hear from some of the advocates of a 2-state outcome, and that is the view of 2 states as a policy imperative, as something we need to do now to advance core Israeli policy objectives or national interests. People who speak in these terms tend less to use the language of moral obligation towards the Palestinians, but focus instead on how a 2-state outcome is, in their view, necessary immediately in order to advance Israel's national interests. Advocates of this position tend to speak about the need to prevent Israel from being isolated in the world, of the need to deny oxygen to the forces of Israel's delegitimization. They speak about Israeli-Palestinian peace as critical to creating a cooperative environment with Sunni Arab states in the region, or enabling us to focus on greater challenges, whether internal to Israeli society or external, such as Iran. And they speak, perhaps most vocally, about a 2-state outcome as necessary, as vital, in their view, to protecting Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. These kinds of policy arguments in favor of a 2-state outcome are cast as being less about the Palestinians and their rights than they are about the welfare and security of Jews in a state of their own. But it is important to notice that this second position, even if couched more in policy terms, represents no less an adamant moral and values claim. The difference is that rather than focusing on the moral obligation to Palestinians, this position focuses on the moral imperative of self-preservation, the goal of advancing Israel's Jewish and democratic character, and of ensuring its enduring future as a place in which Jewish self-determination thrives and is engaged in the world. A third position on this spectrum is the idea of two states as an aspiration, as a worthy goal. Now, advocates of this position essentially say, yes, the goal of two states, of achieving self-determination for the Jewish and the Palestinian people, is the right moral objective. It's the right policy objective. But we just can't get there now. It's impossible, it's impractical, it's dangerous. And so for these people, while they don't abandon the idea, they say that for practical reasons, we don't have the option of making those big decisions now. And their focus becomes much more on what one might call managing the conflict, or keeping hope alive for a resolution sometime in the future. Advocates of this position focus on much more modest objectives: to protect Israel's shorter-term interests, to think of interim arrangements that protect the two-state aspiration, to cultivate coexistence as best we can, while at the same time explaining to the world and to ourselves that the option of actually achieving the two-state outcome is not currently available. This position too, which is quite widely held across the Jewish world, while it uses the language of what is practical, what is doable, has a clear potential moral underpinning. Doing only what is practical can be a moral conviction. True, it can sometimes be an excuse or reflect a kind of lack of higher aspiration. But it can also be driven by a strong belief that aspirations, as noble as they are, when implemented at the wrong time or pursued blindly without regard to what is realistically possible, can end up destroying many, many lives. And that being cautious and restrained is itself a moral requirement if what in the end matters is the welfare of the people you are trying to help. So these are three different ways in which advocates of a two-state outcome articulate their position, either as a moral imperative, or as a policy imperative, or as an aspiration, or perhaps sometimes as some combination of the three. If we continue along the spectrum, listening to the way the Jewish world talks today about peace, I think we hear two other positions that are in fact rejections of the two-state outcome. The first is the idea that a one-state outcome, not a two-state outcome, is a policy imperative. Now, the advocates of this position say essentially that it is impossible to establish a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza without that state becoming a mortal threat to the future survival and legitimacy of the Jewish state. There is no version in their assessment of a Palestinian state that is not a failed state or a terror state that would endanger Israel. And so rather than maintain the current situation, the only real option under this view is to try to imagine a situation where Israel controls the entire territory indefinitely. And while Palestinians, according to this view, may be given certain rights of collective autonomy, rights as individuals or as citizens in an expanded state of Israel, or perhaps rights to territorial self-determination elsewhere, the capacity for Palestinians to establish a separate sovereign Palestinian state of their own in this geographical area is ruled out. And this position is expressed through a core policy argument, which is simply that Palestinian self-determination in the form of a sovereign Palestinian state would risk the future of the Jewish state, that there is no current version of sovereignty for such a state between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River that would not involve a fundamental danger and denial of the Jewish right to self-determination eventually. Here again, the argument is presented in policy terms, but it seems motivated by a core moral, even if controversial, claim that the right and duty of Jewish self-determination and Jewish self-preservation in these circumstances trumps all other values and considerations. If we continue along this spectrum, there's one final voice that I want to describe, and that is the voice that a one-state outcome is a moral imperative. Not just that it's a policy requirement because of an assumption that a Palestinian nation state will never be able to live in true peace with a Jewish nation state, but that there is actually a moral reason why there should be a one-state outcome as a matter of fundamental principle. Now, it is very interesting to note that the view that a one-state outcome is a moral imperative is actually expressed both as a right-wing and a left-wing position. As a right-wing position, the argument is made that what is moral and right to do in this circumstance is to ensure that respect is given to whoever has a more valid claim to the land. For right-wing Jewish advocates of this position, that claim can be based on a divine promise of the land to the Jewish people, on the holiness of the land, or on a historical and legal claim which argues that the Jewish people are the rightful sovereign in this land, by strength, for example, of the League of Nations mandate, which designated this territory as a Jewish national home. What is important to appreciate about this position for the moment is that what animates it is a stated view that what is just and moral is to respect the stronger claim and connection to the land, which for advocates of this position is the Jewish claim. The left-wing version of one state as a moral imperative can come in the form of a counter-argument to the right-wing claim I just made, namely that it is the Palestinian claim to the land, not the Jewish claim, that is actually the stronger claim, and it is the one that needs to be validated. But this argument also comes in a different form, and that is to argue that a two-state outcome would essentially never be able to provide genuine equality both to Jews and Palestinians. The argument goes that it would necessarily undermine the rights of Palestinians, including refugees, to live throughout this land, and it would undermine the rights of Jews to live throughout this land. Advocates of this position often use the moral language of equality and argue in particular that the Palestinian state that would emerge as part of any two-state deal would necessarily be truncated. It would necessarily be less dignified and less equal than the Jewish state, in part because of the difference in power and security calculations between the two sides. And so for those who advance this view, the stated moral requirement here is less about guaranteeing collective self-determination in separate nation states than it is in the hope for a situation in which individual Jews and Palestinians can each live equally in this space, which requires, in their view, some kind of binational state or a neutral state. Now, all these five positions, two states as a moral imperative, two states as a policy imperative, two states as an aspiration, one state as a policy imperative, and one state as a moral imperative. All these positions exist within the Jewish world. And depending where you go, you hear different versions of them. And depending where you go, in most communities, some versions are considered absolutely unacceptable, and some versions are considered the mainstream or at least tolerable. And here it is important to be clear. I am not suggesting that every time these different positions are expressed, they reflect some deep and legitimate moral convictions by the people expressing them. Sometimes these positions are staked out thoughtlessly, in ways that are morally problematic or controversial, or even morally blind. Sometimes they are expressed in ways that show no real attempt to struggle with the reality on the ground, or for that matter, the reality of what may or may not be acceptable or even possible on the Palestinian side. And sometimes these positions are expressed without any regard for their broader moral implications and the potential injustices that could result if these positions were adopted wholesale. The goal here is not to legitimize each of these positions, however and by whomever expressed. It is to challenge ourselves to see, as observers and participants of the Jewish discourse on peace, what possible moral values could drive the different positions along this spectrum, and to ask ourselves seriously what possible place these values have in how we formulate our own positions and in the way we talk and listen to one another. To ask, for example, what weight and consideration should be given to values such as equality or the justness of a legal claim, even if our own position gives priority to some other value and leads us to some other conclusion. What claim should the values and moral convictions that could motivate other positions have upon us, even if we don't embrace them completely? And how do we take them seriously into account? As we go forward in this series, we're going to drill down and try to have a deeper understanding of the role of these values, the role that these values play in our tradition and our sources. We are going to see, hopefully, that even if we as Jews come out in different places along this spectrum, the values which, at their best, can drive other positions along this spectrum are values which we can connect with, which we can respect, and which we need to consider. So, for example, the idea that two states is a moral imperative because the Jewish people have, as a result of their tradition and experience, an obligation to the rights of others, is an idea, a value, that we can connect to as Jews even if we come out in a different place as to what weight to give this value in the circumstances. To take another example, two states as a policy imperative, two states as an aspiration, and one state as a policy imperative all give significant weight to the value of self-preservation. They differ less about the significance of the value of self-preservation than about the application of that value to the facts. They may be influenced by different security experts, but at some level, they are not morally foreign from one another. Their practical conclusions are different, but their moral motivations are not. If that is true, if whether you support one outcome or another turns in practice on whether your factual assessment of the situation leads you to the conclusion that a Palestinian state is either a threat to peace or a critical ingredient for peace, then at least you need not see the person expressing a position different to yours as morally bankrupt, if that position is expressed by them seriously and thoughtfully. They may be analysing the facts differently, but they could be worthy of your moral respect, not your moral contempt. For too long now, the Jewish people seem to have been arguing about peace instead of actually talking about it. Too many of these conversations happen in echo chambers. We enter these conversations with our facts and our politics, and we leave them with our facts and our politics, without having really listened to one another. When there are these intense debates on Israeli-Palestinian peace, on campus or in communities around the Jewish world, I have this feeling that people leave these sessions quietly saying to themselves, you know, I was really impressed with the point of view of that person that I already agreed with. And then saying, you know, I really didn't like the point of view of that person that I already didn't agree with. We listen only for what we want to hear, for that which reaffirms what we already think. In some ways, the intensity and passion with which these debates happen is puzzling. We engage in argument with each other as if that very conversation were going to decide how to end the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But we know, of course, that a talk at your local synagogue or JCC or Shabbat table may not be the place where the solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict will be decided. The truth is that the way we have these arguments about peace across Jewish communities may not determine the future of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but they may well determine the future of our communities. For too many communities, really talking about peace, as opposed to just arguing about it, is almost impossible. Paradoxically, it is the issue of peace itself and the argument around it, perhaps more than any other, that can be the most polarizing and acrimonious. For some rabbis and communal leaders, the issue has become so toxic, so volatile, that they decide it's better not to touch it. If we want to claim peace as a core Jewish value, if we want to stop it from being something that ruptures communities and alienates many Jews, both from Israel and from one another, if we want to be a people that champions deep, respectful, meaningful dialogue, then we need to figure out how we engage this issue of peace, not just as a shallow political conversation, but as a deeper values conversation. A kind of conversation that is not just about exchanging facts and arguments on a policy level, but also excavating the moral principles behind those positions. and thinking how we should calibrate them. We need to take seriously the values that shape our position. We need thoughtful answers as to why we prioritize some values over others. And we need to insist that others cast their position in ways that take values seriously as well. We need a conversation that is neither blind to the complexities and excruciating dilemmas associated with the pursuit of peace in the real world, but not blind either to the importance our tradition and ideas place on the goal of coexistence and peace as quintessential Jewish values and as an animating principle for the Jewish people. It is important to understand that we do not need to do all this in order to reach some grand agreement on how to achieve peace. I'm not even sure consensus is a goal we should aspire to as a people, even if it were possible. Our tradition and value perspectives are too diverse and rich to be exhausted by one opinion, and the reality is just too complex for there to be one answer. We need to reimagine the conversation about peace, first because our health and unity as a people depends in large part on our ability to really talk to each other, to see the merit and the humanity and the values in one another. And second, because if our positions on the challenges facing peace for Israel are not grounded in a serious values conversation, they cease to be compelling, and they risk becoming disconnected from who we want to be as a people of moral excellence. And they risk disconnecting us from Israel in the process. Some may think that the way we argue about peace is basically inevitable, that we don't have an option but to shout at each other, to delegitimize each other. The stakes are too high, the emotions are too raw. But this series and the I Engage project as a whole is committed to the idea that we are better than that an ancient people with the experience, responsibility, and traditions that we have are capable of imagining a different kind of conversation with one another, even on the most difficult issues. You know, we often think that change is impossible before it happens, and then think it's inevitable after it happens. It's going to be in our hands to make that change. And maybe the first step is to begin to connect to and take seriously not just the facts and positions that suit us, but the values that we hold dear and that others hold dear. If we can do that, we can begin to learn how to talk about peace and not just argue about it. We can help reclaim peace as a real and relevant Jewish value. And no less importantly, we can advance the solidarity of the Jewish people and the health and vibrancy of Jewish life. Thank you.
For those that don't know anything about Tal Becker, he served for many decades as a high-level representative of the Israeli government in the various stages of peace talks with the Palestinians, and has shared about that for many, many years. I have to admit, as he was talking, and we're thinking about the people that aren't engaged here, that if we had decided to play a little bit of a drinking game, that every time the word values was used, we'd all take a shot, we would be well inebriated. But obviously the point is made and understood about the kinds of conversations. So what I want to say once again is, if you really want to deepen how this learning can affect you and help you in your ability to understand the various spectrum of views, as Tal just explained, you really should register online and read the readings. There are 6 readings for this week's, and most of them literally correspond to views 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then there's another longer one that has a divergent views that sort of combine them together, and you will understand it a little bit more. Interestingly enough, when we talk about If I were to play a game, or I wish I would have set up some kind of a poll where anonymously people could all put up that might not want to express their views. I would venture to say that most of us are probably somewhere in positions 2, 3, and 4. And at the same time, when I have conversations sometimes with our children or our children's friends or a different generation, they would be more along position number 1 and the left-wing position of a one state as a moral imperative. So let me just review them quickly and the moral underpinnings, and then see if people want to share where you found yourself. 2 states as a moral imperative. The most observed ritual in America is the Seder, where over and over again it talks about avadim hayinu lefaro b'mitzrayim, that we were slaves. And then we bring in the contemporary discussions about slavery and people that are dispossessed and all those things that we bring into our discussions at the Seder as a moral obligation to be champions of the self-determination of others. And therefore, there should be a Jewish moral obligation to the Palestinians, and that should be the one. And that is an argument that one hears among more of the left-leaning Jewish organizations like J Street and others, but also amongst the younger generation that feel sometimes disenfranchised with the discussion of mainstream Jewish community. The 2 states as a policy imperative versus the moral imperative, right, is that in a sense, we need to have a unilateral policy to take the steps towards a 2-state solution. Because, right, we need to make sure that Israel's respected throughout the year, to deny, in a sense, oxygen to the delegitimization, to BDS, to claiming that Israel's apartheid state, to having relationships with the Arab world. And therefore, there's a policy of 2 states as a moral point, a values point of peace as necessary to protect Israel as a Jewish and a democratic state. For the imperative, the moral imperative of self-preservation. Self-preservation. The third one is an aspirational view of the 2 states, right? It's impossible, impractical, dangerous to think about implementing 2 states at this moment, right? And therefore, the moral value is that being cautious and restrained is good for the welfare of people you're trying to help, the people in Israel. So in some sense, the current Israeli government now is using this language very often. You need to shrink the conflict, right? You shrink down the parameters of the conflict, and you try to do what you can to build up for aspirational, to build up the Palestinians, to provide things for them, but yet at the same time to implement 2 separate states is too dangerous. The fourth one state as a policy imperative, basically looks at what's happened since the Oslo Agreement. We all know the history here. Most of us have been a part of talking about Israel. And when you look at the volatility of what's happened from the Oslo peace process, from Gaza to everything else, right? All the different parts of the process from the Intifada to giving back Gaza to Hamas, that there's a mortal threat to the survival of the Jewish state, and that the right of self-preservation tells us that we need to have one state, yes, give some level of authority and some level of equality within the Palestinian enclaves, but as a policy imperative, that we need to think of one state. The one state of moral imperative, well, you can tell me, what's the right-wing moral imperative that's Torah-based? It's coming up in 2 weeks. Torah portion of Lech Lecha, right? God says to Abraham, Lech lecha la'artzecha, and go to the land that I am giving you. Now, at the same time, one could argue, he says, and all the world will be blessed by you. But it seems pretty clear, Torahitically, that we are promised the land, the physical land of Israel, north, south, east, and west. Well, that would be that we have a moral and valid claim of a promise that was made to the Jewish people, and we have to respect that Jewish claim and that connection to the land. The left-wing version of the one state is again one I said that many of the younger generation and all of these positions exist within Israel as well. Of course, it's not just the American or the diaspora community. Is that moral language of equality? That equality is impossible unless you have in a two-state. So unless you have a binational or a neutral state, equality, which is the ultimate moral, and after all, that is what many in our generation have been raised on here in America and throughout the world, that everybody is equal, everybody's life matters, and therefore that should apply to the land of Israel. So, who's willing to share, as you heard Tal's speech, as you heard me reiterate it, where you feel you would place yourself and what guides that decision? And we're in a safe space. I mean, as I say, I could guess as to where most of us would fall. But if you don't fall there, please, the whole idea here is to hear divergent views.
I'm surprised that Tal didn't mention birth rate and the challenge of that with the one-state solution. That's a great concern of mine. A one-state solution, unless we subjugate the Palestinians and we don't make them equal partners or give them any position in statehood, or I shouldn't say in statehood, in citizenship, then they'll be outvoting us and there will be no Israel anymore. So I'm surprised that didn't come up. So for that reason, I don't see that anything other than a two-state solution could work.
Okay, so first of all, let me say, and then Edie, you can go next, that it is addressed a little bit here or there, and those different issues in more detail in the background reading, which is why if you spend the 45 minutes between this week and next week reading the background reading, it will further suss out what those different views are in the spectrum of those views. Edie? You got to unmute yourself.
The first thought I had was I would be more open to a two-state solution for the very reason that David just spoke of. And I'm not sure, my first reaction, if it was a two-state solution, the first one being moral, but then there's so much fear because there's so much hate from the Arabs towards Israel that's kind of scary too. So I don't know.
Okay, and the two states as a moral imperative has many implications, a lot of implications. But there are many groups within Israel, Peace Now type groups and others, that say that, our moral obligation to the rights of others is something that for them is what identifies us at our very core as Jews and why they have it. That's why I said most of us are probably more comfortable, because you did express discomfort a little bit, even though you can understand the values that underpin that, which is the goal, obviously, but that, you probably fall more comfortably in the two states of 2 and 3 than you would in 1. Okay, anybody else? I hope. Somebody? Nobody?
All right, I'll do something.
Go ahead. I knew if I waited long enough, right?
We did it. So I'm somewhere between 2 and 3. I think that self-preservation is number 1. I think that's I think self-preservation of the Jews. But I think the way to accomplish that is to have a two-state solution where there's a viable Palestinian state. But at this time, I don't see that happening. I don't see it there. So I think it's an aspiration more. I'm somewhere in the middle there. And I think a lot of Israelis right now, I have one sitting right here. Thank goodness, my son is here. So for the wedding. So yeah, he would probably agree with that.
Does he want to make a comment? If he was listening?
No, he didn't hear the whole thing. He was at
Oh, okay.
yeah.
I mean, that would, as I said before, be my guess, where many of us who grew up from the time, over the last 50 years, committed to Israel and seeing what's occurred, would probably find ourselves, in between positions 2 and 3. Anybody else? Rachel, please. Who's had a lot of conversations with people that would find themselves in very different positions.
So one thing I'm having a problem with is that whatever we say we think we agree with really makes no difference, because it's really the Palestinian side that has to somehow also be a part of this conversation, if anything would ever work. And so I find it a little difficult, because a lot of work has to be done before any of this could ever be implemented. And so if I would choose anything, I would choose 3, because while we have the aspiration, there's a lot of work that needs to get done, because change has to happen somewhere. And so, I'm teaching the course about Jews at the forefront of change. Somehow that change has to be begun.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
And so again, that's literally, part of what the Israeli government, the message that it's been putting out, ironically by Naftali Bennett, who, if you look back at articles that he wrote, 6 or 7 years ago, was really arguing one state solution as a policy imperative, option 4, but now is coming across, at least with the patina, or potentially, and dealing with the diaspora outside of Israel, as shrinking the conflict, right? It's impossible, impractical, it's dangerous, but we need to do something. But once again, what Tal would say, Rachel, is that there is a moral nature to that as well, just to reiterate. And that is, Jonathan Tobin's article, if you read the article, speaks about that being cautious and restrained for the welfare of a people, for the welfare of Israel, is a moral value as well, right? It's a practical value, but it's also a moral value. Anybody else?
So I'm smack on number 3 for aspirational, because about the time of my bar mitzvah, I was aspirational. And now 50 years later, I find myself in exactly the same spot. And I think some of that is what Rachel just shared, is that this conversation needs to be extremely deeper and inclusive of both Israel and Palestine. So I'm smack in the middle, smack on number 3, right, in agreement.
And I think, I think many of us, and we'll be concluding in a minute, but I think many of us have actually shifted, which we didn't talk about. I'm sure that if I would ask you to sort of chart out where you were as a teenager, where you were as a young adult, where you were when you had young children, and over the decades, if your own position may have shifted with a different set of values and moral imperatives. Certainly, that's why we see essentially some of the younger generation taking positions than some of us that might have had those positions in earlier years and not now. The biggest issue is none of them are here tonight, or none of them willing to share that, and our need for really knowing at least and understanding where other people are coming from, since so many of us probably fall into that center part. So once again, anyone willing to volunteer on tech, if you feel you can show videos and have them download, please. Next week we'll be doing unit number 2, but if you register and what was sent, it'll be online, that form, as well as in the divrei, then you'll be able to read the background readings, which will deepen and give more nuance to Tal Becker's. So thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful evening and Shabbat Shalom.
You as well.
Shabbat shalom.
So much.
Thank you so much. Shabbat
Thank you,
shalom.
Rabbi.
Thank you,
Shabbat
Rabbi.
shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Bye all.
Shabbat shalom, everybody.
Bye.